Hello, everyone. I am the director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is super proud to be presenting this series this evening. It's the first event of a wider group of events, which really tries to bring together two areas that are often separated. How do we create wealth? How do we create value? And how do we distribute it? And that very much has to actually begin with a mapping of who's actually doing what, but also who then captures the benefits from that. So I've just put it in the chat, a website, which goes to the broader series where you can see some of the other events that will follow from tonight's launch event. Thank you, Victoria, for scrolling down. The second one on May 12th will be myself and Anand Yuderitis looking at the whole question of how do philanthropies, the state, and business actually interact around wealth creation. And again, who owns it, what, and why? His own book, Winner Takes All, has looked at how much of the funding actually that comes from philanthropies has been a result of value extraction mechanisms, both in terms of tax evasion and other sources. So it's not just about kind of who's financing what and why, but also where does this finance actually come from? Without taking too much time in terms of going through each one of these, let me just announce them. The third event will be on the global housing crisis and the home ownership myth. And again, in terms of the finance in the economy, which has over-financialized our economies in terms of creating massive amounts of credit, which have resulted in a massively high private debt. We always talk about public debt, but private debt to disposable income ratio in the UK and the US and so forth. That comes itself from a very specific form of capitalism, which we have sort of accepted and sometimes think is inevitable, but in fact could actually change if we govern the financial system, but also if we think of the supply and demand of housing, but actually focused on what are we trying to do? Why are we just creating it? Why are we just making it so much easier to buy homes instead of actually investing in things like social housing? And why are we making it so easy for people to take out credit to buy homes when their real wages haven't actually increased for the last 30 years? Anyway, that's going to unpick the whole who owns what and why around real estate, housing, and land. And Josh Ryan Collins, who you might know, who's one of our professors, has written an excellent book on that, and he'll be chairing it. Another event on, let me see here, my eyes are failing, June 30th will be on digital feudalism, the future of data capitalism. This event is actually an outcome of a project we have, a research project also funded by the Ameteor Foundation, which is looking at the concept of algorithmic rents. It's not enough to talk about kind of big tech. We also need to look at who financed that tech in the first place. But also what is the business model, which is creating problems for how algorithms are actually used. Algorithms, just like a hammer, can be used to either build a house or to knock someone on the head. Algorithms themselves can be used to either create value, extract value. And that session will actually be looking at how the way that we are currently creating value around digital platforms is part of the problem. And so we can't just pick up the mess afterwards through better tax policy, privacy policy, and so on. We need to actually create a different type of digital platform system and govern it towards public good and common good characteristics. And lastly, really important in the run up to COP26, we'll be looking at the Green New Deal. And if you listen to Greta Thunberg when she was 16, now she's 18, she says, just listen to the scientists. Well, that's true for the green bit, but the deal bit, which is about the negotiation or actually new social compact between public, private, civil society organizations, what is, again, the who owns what and why question bring to that debate in terms of distribution issues. And lastly, when I use the word distribution, I think a really useful word for this whole series is the notion of pre-distribution, that it's not about redistributing wealth that's created in one place in terms of ownership, but actually getting those conditions right ex ante so we don't have to pick up the mess afterwards. Anyway, I'm going to hand over now to my wonderful colleague, Else Torreele, who is going to be chairing this session. She will introduce both the session and the speakers in it. So I just hope you all join us not only for tonight, you're here, but especially for the whole series, and also engage with some of the IIPP output. My colleague Henry Lee during the session today will also be putting in the chat some of our current output around tonight's session, but this is very much a byproduct of the more overall research agenda, but also education agenda that we have in the Institute. So please do follow us. And over to Else.
So big pleasure to be here. Maybe I can ask my co-panelists to put on their cameras so that our audience can see us. So, well, thanks also, Mariana, for joining us and for introducing the WOWOW series. It's quite a spectacular agenda, so I'm looking forward myself to following all the other sessions as well. So today's debate will really focus on medical innovation, health innovation. As you can all imagine, in the middle of COVID and all the access related issues that were confronted, this is a very, very timely subject. And so we will be exploring how the ownership of key knowledge, but also infrastructure and know-how is being governed, the public and private partnerships, and how indeed that the distribution or the redistribution or the failure of good distribution today could have been taught differently if we had pre-distributed, as Mariana was saying. We'll also discuss how benefit sharing, possible value creation, value extraction is working within health innovation, and I have an exquisite panel for you to discuss that with people who have been working for many years on that interface between medical innovation and access and creation of value in health, which in general is much more about therapeutic value, not so much about money, although this has kind of been corrupted a little bit over the years. So it's my real pleasure to introduce you to the three speakers for this conversation. Firstly, Suerie Moon, co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. I'm myself also based in Geneva, and also professor of practice, interdisciplinary program, and international relations and political science. She's been having a long background in research around research and development governance, lately a lot around a new business model for pharmaceutical R&D, also pathogen and benefit sharing in the context of global epidemics. And so I'm sure she will bring a perspective of really the governance of R&D at the global health level. Then we have Amy Kapczynski, professor of law at Yale Law School and also faculty co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership, also faculty co-director of the Law and Political Economy Project and co-founder of the Law and Political Economy blog, but also possibly 20-25 years of experience around access to medical innovation, and I think also founder of the student group Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is, I think, still today an important actor in this field. And then finally, but not at least, we have Victor Roy, who is currently a resident physician at the Boston Medical Center and clinical instructor in the Boston University Department of Family Medicine. He's duly trained as a physician and a sociologist, so that's a very interesting combination, and has been doing quite a lot of work, including at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, on the financialization of biomedical innovation and its consequences, of course, for vulnerable patients. He's, of course, a research associate still at IIPP and author, importantly, of a forthcoming book called Capitalizing a Cure: How Finance Controls the Price and Value of Health, which I believe was mostly focused on the example of the infamous hepatitis C medicines. So maybe one final point to repeat, to say that there is a Twitter hashtag that was projected earlier on the screen. So hashtag IIPPWOWAW. And of course, you can send your questions to the Q&A and they will be curated, and so that after we have a conversation with the three panelists, we can entertain some of your questions. So without further ado, looking back at the title of this session, Are We Paying Twice for Medical Innovation? We already got an email from a colleague, friend, Professor Don Light from Stratford, pointing out that actually twice is probably an underestimation, that probably we should say 3 or 4 times, and bringing some arguments. I think it's not about how many times, but I think we all agree that we are paying quite a lot of times or too much for the medical innovation. And the connection to the who owns what and why series, where ownership is central, I think is very clear in medical innovation, that the question of ownership is really, really important. And as we see today in the discussions around COVID vaccines in particular, but also other COVID-related technologies, the question of ownership and who controls the availability today of vaccines. I mean, we are in a total vaccine apartheid situation where I was reading today that over 80% of the 1 billion doses of vaccines that have been administered today have been administered in only 10 countries. And there are still countries around the world where even the healthcare workers in the most vulnerable groups have not seen a vaccine. So that failure to distribute in an equitable way and according to needs, I think is so flagrant. And at the heart of that is the question of control and ownership. But it's not just through intellectual property and patents, although we will discuss it, and it is a very important one. There is actually ownership in many more things, and the question of knowledge, the ownership of knowledge and know-how and infrastructure, for instance, to produce vaccines, is today more than ever at the forefront. The ownership of the creativity, and again, it's not just the patents, but other ways in which we have built on research from the past to create these vaccines today that are now owned by a handful of companies. And so I want to take this opportunity, having these fantastic panelists, to move the conversation a little bit from what is already out there. And so I want to start with Suerie. So you've been studying R&D ecosystems for a long time. And so can you talk a little bit and unpack the different elements of what actually goes into innovation? I mean, it's not just money, it's also not just the patents, but the infrastructure. And then in particular, how is the ownership of these different elements distributed and governed? And how, I mean, what according to you are the problems, and maybe have they evolved since 20 years to where we are today, and maybe thinking about the narrative of who owns the innovation in function of who owns all these different elements. So
I have to say it's a real honor to be with my fellow panelists and to be in the inaugural webinar of the coolest acronymed webinar that I've heard of in this epidemic of webinars that we've all been enjoying over the last year and a half. And I'm not sure if you have a pronunciation yet of wow, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it. And I do think once we look at the R&D system, there's a lot of wow in terms of understanding what's happening, why is it happening, and what does it mean ultimately for all of us. And I think that this pandemic and the inequalities in vaccine access, which do affect every single person on the planet, those of us who have vaccines, and of course more directly those of us who don't, but it really does have implications for every single person, whether we are able to find ways of sharing the knowledge and the technology that have been developed through what is fundamentally a public and private, a hybrid public and private endeavor. And I think one way to think about kind of the traditional R&D model is that you have an initial role that is very publicly funded, and often public labs or academic labs who are doing, of course, decades of basic research and building that up into the knowledge base that allows for technologies eventually to be developed. And traditionally, you had private companies, of course, coming in at a later stage when there is still risk, but that risk has been decreased quite significantly by public funding, subsidies, and knowledge. And then private companies come in and they invest at far decreased levels of risk to develop a product further and bring it to market. And then this is where the public again comes in as the buyers of technologies. And I think this is where the kind of idea of paying twice does come in. What we've seen during COVID, but not just COVID, is there have been, in fact, lots of really important changes in this R&D system. That's a very traditional kind of cartoon model that I've just outlined, but there are some really important changes. And one is that public money, de-risking, subsidization, certainly in COVID, has been far more extensive, both at the beginning, middle, and the end of the process than in sort of standard normal times, where you have a decrease of risk and a decrease of cost borne by private actors from the beginning of R&D through manufacturing all the way to the end in terms of purchasing vaccines and other products. And so there has been this accompaniment. What is surprising to me is that with this public sector accompaniment of the R&D process all the way through, you would think that we would have managed to retain control of that knowledge and technology. And what we're finding today is that unfortunately that's really not the case, or that the mechanisms that we should have to control the production and distribution of knowledge have not been sufficient. And I think one of the best examples of that is, the other day we had the CEO of Moderna. And it's very clear, there's clear public information that 100% of Moderna's R&D costs were borne by the public sector for the COVID-19 vaccine. He said, I just don't have time for technology transfer. This is just not a priority for me. And I get why he said that, because indeed, for a private company, it is not your priority to share technology to vaccinate the world. It's not in your self-interest to enable, indeed, companies that may become competitors and use an mRNA platform in the future. I mean, this is common sense in the business world. But of course, this goes completely against the public interest, the national public interest and the global public interest in getting that technology out as quickly as possible to everybody. And here you see a very clear mismatch, because I think even at least some individuals within the US government and certainly many other governments really want to get that technology out. But in many ways, you have the know-how really held by private firms and controlled by private firms. And I think it's really a great example of how we have to find better ways to retain that control of technology, so that we don't have this kind of capture, this sort of monopolization of knowledge, especially knowledge that is as essential for the public interest as COVID-19 vaccines are today. If I could add just one more comment in terms of some of the big changes we've seen, and I think this speaks to a lot of the work that you've been doing at IIPP, and I know some work that Dr. Victor Roy has been doing. It is that what used to be, one single company, vertically integrated, beginning, investing rather early on in R&D, bringing something all the way through and waiting many years, right? Waiting patiently, 10, 12 years, sometimes longer to bring a product to market. That's really no longer the mainstream model. And instead what you have is this relay race where knowledge and technology and IP gets handed off from one runner to the next. And every time that baton gets passed from a government to an academic lab, to a spin-off, to a startup, to a larger firm, etc., there's an extraction of value. There are profits that are made, and there's risk that is no longer being assumed. And so you have more players intervening in multiple parts of the R&D process to extract and control value than you did in the past, but also a different distribution of who's taking on the risk. And so I think we have to stop thinking in terms of the old model of a single firm, valiantly taking on risk and costs, and think more in terms of relay races. What can we do to actually intervene in the relay race, so that what's happening in the middle is that the baton is being privatized in a way. The baton is being captured in such a way that the benefits are not accruing to society at large.
That's a fantastic framing, and building on that and going to Amy. One of the most important elements of the control is through intellectual property rights. Can you speak a little bit more to how this has become increasingly, if I can say, extractive in the way that Suerie was also describing, in the sense that often there is a whole lot of research over many years by many people that have contributed, that have somehow culminated in a final product. And somehow this can be captured, all of that can be captured through mostly intellectual property, but maybe not only, to be owned by one, for instance, company, and that can be traded then. But how that capturing happens, and whether there would be other ways of thinking about the knowledge that is less with one owner who captures everything, but actually a more collective ownership, maybe?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm also delighted to be here with you all, and really appreciate the chance to have this conversation. So I think maybe worth starting just with a basic introduction to patents and intellectual property law, because it may not be as familiar to everybody as it is to all of us. So the form of intellectual property we're talking about predominantly is patents. They are granted by governments. They cover a particular territory, and they allow you to be the only person. If you prove that you've invented something new and useful and non-obvious, there's a slightly different language in different countries for those requirements, then you get a 20-year exclusive right to be the one to use this invention. And part of what Els, you're putting on the table is a really important question, which is who gets patents and what do they do with them? And the way our system works very much now, as Suerie beautifully laid out, we have a very complex and rich kind of ecosystem from which these massive breakthroughs like COVID vaccines emerge. And it is heavily publicly financed, sort of particularly at the front end, all the basic research and the kind of more risky and breakthrough kinds of scientific findings. And it's actually very true in COVID as well. Public science that in fact goes into sequencing the original COVID virus and sharing that around the world, and public science that went into building the actual kind of modified protein structure that's a component of most of the COVID vaccines, right? So public science is very involved, particularly at the earlier stages. In fact, in COVID, what was a little bit unusual was how involved public science was funding up to the final moment, including production and manufacturing facilities and all the rest of it, right? So sometimes the public's involved throughout the whole life cycle, particularly in crises. But control over really critical questions of price and supply is essentially handed off to the private sector, because they are, in the way our system is organized, they are the sort of, they stand over the last part of the process, the actual kind of formulating of the medicines, particularly later stage clinical research, and then the marketing and the gaining of government authorization, permission from regulatory authority to bring a drug or a vaccine to market. And that's based on, in some sense, a very old model, which has some virtues, which is that government science and open science or public science tends to not be patented very often. And that could be for a couple of reasons. One might be it's not eligible for patents. Patents require something to be new and non-obvious and inventive. And you have to show these things. It's a process that costs money and it can be somewhat time consuming. So sometimes governments don't seek patents, or scientists in the public sector don't seek patents. Other times their research might be of the kind that isn't patentable. So there are things that are excluded from patent law. Part of what's interesting about that is that it's some of the things that are most valuable to us, like quote unquote laws of nature. If you discover a fundamental theorem, or in fact, you identify the sequence of a viral genome now in the United States and many other countries, those kinds of things cannot be patented. They're considered too foundational. And so the most foundational stuff is actually excluded, and in some ways for very good reasons, right? That allows others to build on it, and that allows it to be the basis of a kind of distributed effort and a common effort in development. But of course, what happens is if you layer exclusivity on the very last stage, where the money is made and where decisions are made about who gets what, whether that's who gets what COVID vaccine doses when there's scarce manufacturing supply, or who's able to afford the final product, you've allocated control entirely to profit-making companies. And as Suerie points out, those companies don't have reason to do what's in the public's interest. They have reason to do what's in their interest. And those two do not align, particularly when you have monopolies. And that's essentially what a patent in intellectual property is. It gives a company a monopoly. And as we all know, and we could talk about it more length, what we expect monopolists to do is restrict supply and raise price. It's and so it's very much a sort of deep, in some sense, design defect of the system that we have. It's also, I think, the product of some good ideas about open science that in some sense are in a disconnect with the ideas about closed science that sort of is where the process ends up. And there's a couple of things that we might think about doing about that. As you said, how might we do it differently? one thing that we could do, and I think it's strategically important at the current moment, is to call out the importance of public sector research, all these contributions made by the academy and others. And where there are public patents, in fact, try to enforce them and use them as leverage. And this is something that many of us have been encouraging in the coronavirus context. If you, as the US government, as it does, NIH holds a key patent that is being infringed by Moderna, among others, companies that are not or simply sort of washing their hands of the global crisis, those patents should be used as leverage to say, well, you know, if this is the game where everybody enforces patents, then, you know, why not enforce ours, but not to make money, but to ensure that public interests are met. So, for example, to increase supply, so lower prices, not increase prices, and so forth. But that's really, I would say, a kind of a reactive short-term strategy. I mean, I think in the longer term, what we need really is an articulation of public policy for innovation that recognizes that patents do create real serious barriers to research, that has structures, whether it's patent pools or restrictions on patents that require certain parts to be entirely patent free, and in other contexts that reward innovation, but either with some measure of, you know, fair pricing and a sense of what a kind of fair supply is. And that could be done in a variety of ways. In the US, we're having big debates about price controls, and there's a lot of momentum to introduce price controls, which of course Europeans have had for much longer than we have. But we also, I think, should be thinking about other models of rewarding the investment that the private sector makes in things, whether they're prizes or in fact kind of royalties, things like that, that would allow us to maybe produce more in a non-monopoly way, and also do science in a non-monopoly way, while, you know, kind of integrating some of that in. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, is that my own view is that much more research, including to the last stage, should be done in the public sector. And if that were the case, then you'd have no problem with having to figure out what the right royalty is, with having to figure out, you know, sort of how to keep the private sector engaged, given there are many other profit opportunities. You would simply need to create a robust system that you would expect to have many failures, because, you know, not all scientific projects work out. And that at the end of the day, the more you publicly finance it, the more you can reap the benefits of people sharing in a common way these forms of this kind of human ingenuity that, in fact, you know, was always never attributable to one person, and share the benefits by having fair prices, and probably the lowest prices you can get, we think, will come if there are no restrictions, monopoly restrictions associated with these inventions.
Thanks so much. These are already a few kind of concrete suggestions that we can come back to maybe a bit later. I want to go to Victor. You have studied a very, I think, among the health people, not so well-known phenomenon, financialization, but that we've now learned through your work and some others, Mariana's and Bill Lazonek and others, is actually really important in the pharma sector. Can you speak a little bit to that, and linking it to indeed what Amy and Suerie have already mentioned? Something that puzzles me, that is that the way money is being seen and even valued, if I can say so, in the public sector or in the private sector seems to be very different, with a lot of consequences. And I mean, if we plead for more public research, meaning, or public financing of research, often then we're talking about grants, which is a very different type of money than, for instance, a venture capitalist investing and the whole financialized business model. And so can you elaborate that a little bit for our audience? Because I think certainly in the health field, this is something that we have only learned relatively recently, and it's so important.
Thanks for having me as part of this discussion. It's really exciting to be on, and I've learned so much from the two previous speakers and you else over the years. So it's an honor to be part of it. In terms of, so I want to connect actually some of what both Suerie and Amy have already described in the way financialization and sort of intellectual property intersect, right? And so I think in the popular imagination, the idea is that sort of pharmaceutical companies, they're getting money potentially from their investors or shareholders, and then they're using that to develop knowledge and IP. And then when they make money, they're supposed to maximize shareholder return because the shareholders have taken a risk in the process. But that's actually not at all how this process really works. If you look at the end stage kind of shareholders of the big pharmaceutical corporations, actually themselves are not making any financial risk into the process. They're trading on the stock price of the company for which they're owning shares in, right? And that's being driven by, for these companies, increasingly they're trying to meet not just certain sort of profitability thresholds, they're supposed to grow by 10%, or some threshold in the financial market. And so for them, being acquisition specialists, trying to acquire IP that might be valuable in the future, sort of is a way of de-risking, like Suerie mentioned, the process, and being able to sort of accrue that kind of growth that's expected. But I think in the process, when you have a lot of different actors involved, like Suerie was mentioning, there's lots of exchanges happening. This actually changes the way we need to think about intellectual property too, where IP in this process is a financial asset, right? And the way all these intermediaries are sort of making money is through sort of this forecasted valuation that in the future, one day, the buyer will pay more for this good if it were to become a product than even the current health system might be for the existing standard of care, right? That's sort of the way the market is pricing these assets. They're saying, well, if the health system is paying, $70,000 for a hepatitis C medicine today, then if we came up with a better drug, maybe the health system can be compelled to pay $90,000, right? Which is sort of what we saw in the hepatitis C case. And that valuation is what people are trading off of to make capital gains, right? So that's sort of how, I think what happens in that process is that the relationship, and I'd be curious for sort of Amy's perspective on this from a political economy perspective, the intellectual property, the relationship between the inventor and society sort of breaks. You have it becomes another financial asset that people are trading off of and trying to accrue as much as they can in terms of extracting rewards. And then sort of bringing it back to the shareholder piece. If you look at Pfizer, for example, they're in terms of the rents that they're going to be able to accrue from owning this IP over the vaccine, much of it will go to the corporate shareholders in the form of buybacks and dividends. But the shareholders themselves really didn't actually risk their own capital into the process. It was de-risked by the state. And then if there are expenses from Pfizer, a lot of that money is coming from retained capital that they have from prior sales. And so that's the way in which I think we can think about sort of value extraction taking place, particularly in the late stages and the financial stakeholders of the kind of larger corporations. And it's connected, I think, to kind of a certain conception of price, which is that we're supposed to pay more for a better treatment. And then it's sort of pitched to us as the public that we as a society almost morally should be willing to pay more for better things because otherwise you're not going to have them. And I think, we sort of see this logic being embedded, and it's a logic that actually comes from the way we pay for like luxury goods, right? For houses or for nice cars. But if we get a better treatment, then as a society, we should pay more for it. And that's, gets packaged into the logic of value-based pricing, sort of connecting to some of that conversation where what drops from view is how value is being created, right? And then how value is being extracted in the process, I'd say. So I think that those are some of the points in terms of how IP is turned into like really it's another financial asset, and where do corporate shareholders of the large firms, to the extent that they shouldn't have value being really returned to them because it wasn't actually in the first place risked by them into the process.
Thanks, Victor. And I think the issue of risk, and several of you have mentioned that, and how risk is valued, I think is also a central question that, a government taking risks. I mean, what we see, for instance, with the massive investments that governments has done throughout the whole R&D process, including manufacturing capabilities and pre-market, pre-approval purchase commitments, etc., is an enormous de-risking for the private sector. But for the government, it's not seen as a matter of risk. They just pay. While for when a private company invests, it's seen as a risk they take and they need to be rewarded. While if the government does that, that doesn't seem to be associated with the same perception. And I think there's a lot of narrative here too, and also the fact that the government, and Mariana has written a lot about that, the idea that the role of the government in innovation is to de-risk and then get out of the way, instead of actually to direct the innovation towards benefit for society. And I think in health innovation, it's very clear that the benefit for society is only realized when there is wide availability and affordable access. And I want to highlight another aspect here that, I mean, Victor, you say, okay, it's the IP, intellectual property, is seen as a financial asset. Both Amy and Suerie, you've described the role of IP into what is being, traded and handed over in the relay race. But one of the biggest problems, I think, in medical innovation is that IP, there is no link between intellectual property and what deserves to have intellectual property and medical benefits. And I think that this is already a very fundamental design problem of the whole system, because the only medical innovation that is getting developed, that is getting to the society, is that can be patented. And so you can have fantastically great technologies and opportunities for medical benefit, but if you cannot patent them today in the system, they just go nowhere. And the corollary of that is, if we think today, I mean, everybody talks about the amazing mRNA vaccine technology. It seems, as far as we can tell, an extremely powerful technology, and it's actually a platform technology, which means that now that the proof of principle has been delivered that you can develop safe and effective vaccines using this mRNA tool, it can possibly be adopted for a variety of applications. Then it turns out to be relatively easy to produce and to scale, etc. If we can see that, I mean, a year ago, no one has ever produced an mRNA vaccine, and today they are being produced in the millions. So although the industry claims now, it's so difficult, we were the only ones that can do it, if you put the resources and the technology transfer, clearly in a year's time, you can produce millions of doses. So this powerful technology now, moreover, mostly being financed, the research for many, many years, mostly being financed by public resources. How can we create that into a collective tool so that it can be used to develop the best possible products for public health benefits? And it cannot be public health benefit when it's just captured and developed only for applications that the companies think they can make a lot of money for. So I think there is a lot there the fact that we don't have a way in our medical innovation ecosystem today to direct to give the direction of the innovation towards actual public health benefits, both on the medical side and then the accessibility, I think is a real fundamental design issue, right? Wanted to come back on the question of the I'm calling it collective ownership. Do you think there are, and it's a question, I don't know who wants to give a go at that, how could we create something that is actually a collective ownership? Are there legal models to do that, or should we look at that? I'll look at Amy or Suerie. is it a question of governance, of how to govern the relations between the public and the private sector? Because, you know, we can say, well, all medical innovation should be done by the public sector. I don't think that's realistic at this stage, because you may want to have the interaction between public and private sectors, but how can you do that such that there is a collective ownership and linking it to medical benefits? You have any ideas of where we can start with that?
I mean, the traditional way that I think governments have done this has not focused on ownership, but is focused on the government's power as a regulator. And so in some ways, I think what you say, Elle, is very right, that the kind of canonical story, especially in economics as a field, is that the government de-risks and they do the basic research. The fact is there aren't market-led incentives for drug development because everything is organized in rich countries by insurance. And insurance has all kinds of rules. You know, in the US, we have far fewer of them, and it's much more friendly to kind of companies pricing whatever they like. But even here, you know, there's rules that you have to have a first-in-class medicine provided by an insurer. And so those structure all of the incentives, in fact, of the industry. And so I think that's the sort of one first thing to say, which is that we have for many years, in fact, had a government-led innovation system. You know, we provide patents on the one side, and we also regulate insurance. We mandate it in many countries. And many countries, of course, also set drug prices in some evaluative process that has to do with their value. And that is very much setting incentives, right? And the question is that the best way to do it? Or I think one way, as your question runs, is should the public be getting more for its investment? Should it actually have an ownership stake? That's a very interesting question that I don't think most people talk or think about, because the existing models are very entrenched, right? I mean, you know, so when the US had a financial crisis and the government bought GM, like they basically owned a lot of our auto industry. Then they sort of saved it, and a year later they sold it, and they made a lot of money actually. And that's a very different structure than just contributing the money and then never getting it back. I think it's a really deep question whether you want the government as an owner to play more of a robust role as opposed to as a regulator. I mean, I think it's inevitable that we are setting public policy, for example, by setting drug prices. I think we should do more to ensure both fair drug pricing, even in a public-private system, and to ensure that we have particular incentives for research, that there's more public investment into research and that there's more openness and there aren't patent barriers to doing research. So, and all those don't have to necessarily come along with the thing that, at least in patent terms, we would call ownership. They might just be a whole set of public policies that are overlaid upon the R&D system to ensure that we can solve all the problems that you're talking about by a combination of investment, overriding restrictions like patents where they're a problem, price regulation, and so forth. So I do think you could sort of, there's many ways to construct what you're sort of calling common property. And it doesn't necessarily have to look like the government owning the pharmaceutical company or even the government's owning the patent. It could be that the government has an overall in some sense, ownership of innovation policy, acknowledges that it's not just the market that's doing this, but we're doing this and we're deciding what should be developed and how, and being more overt about what we need to do, where the gaps are and how we want to spend money, and also being more, I think, assertive about how we ensure access, because there's vast issues, even in countries that have price controls, that prices are causing for access.
And I guess one element that has come up many times already in terms of government as a regulator, that is strings attached to all the public financing of the research. I mean, if we see today that for the COVID vaccines, there has been so many opportunities where governments could have demanded, I mean, whether it's transparency or a certain allocation or production of the vaccines, technology transfer, plenty of things. but so far they have not been very willing to do that.
Yeah, that's an
Yes.
excellent point, right? That when the government is giving money, it can of course impose conditions on what happens at the end of the day, and they've chosen not to, in part on this old model that, you know, we donate everything to the private sector.
Yeah. Suerie, you want to say a few words on for instance, like are there ways, I mean, collective ownership? We hear more and more talk about commons. Commons is the kind of like, it's, I don't know how to think about it. It's kind of like diluting the idea that ownership can be allocated to, I mean, either individuals or individual firms, but that we actually kind of say, well, we all can use it. Basically, it's you don't even have to own it. If you can make use of it, can be an interesting way of certain things like, you know, medical knowledge and medical technologies, because there is something different about medical innovation versus other types, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think for me, one of the beautiful things about knowledge is that you can have multiple owners, right? You don't have to own it to benefit from it and to make use of it. You can actually make it publicly available as a global public good, as you know, this phrase has been used and abused a lot over the last year, but I think that is one of the things about knowledge that we fundamentally have to start with. I mean, this is the starting point. I wanted to go back to the question of governments, though, and the role of governments, because we've been talking about the public and the private sector in quite general terms. And I think that, again, you know, I'm quite obsessed with COVID-19 vaccines these days, so excuse me for coming back to this as an example, but it's not all governments that have put so much money into the R&D process. It's actually a handful, and I think we have to begin asking, why is it that national governments, individual governments, do not generally openly share the technology that they pay for? And one reason is it could be ideological, it could be they don't think it's their role, but another reason that we haven't touched on yet is strategic geopolitical interests. And you know, certainly governments could have said, yeah, we'll develop technologies and make them openly available, but when a vaccine is considered something that's essential to get your economy going again, to restore normal life, to end the pandemic in your own country first, then what is the incentive for that government to say, I want to make it openly available? And I think, you know, my colleagues at the Global Health Center have been gathering data on R&D investments. And, you know, some of the things we did was just see who, in fact, were the largest investors. And I think it won't be too much of a surprise. The US government is number one, is the largest investor. Number two is Germany. Number three is the UK, and then you have the European Union. If we look at, if we include CEPI in the mix, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, it actually comes in third place. So you have the US, Germany, and CEPI. And what's interesting to note is that CEPI actually takes investments from, you know, money, public money. It's 97, 98% public money from, you know, a larger number of governments, pools it together, and then invested it in COVID-19 vaccines. Now, the reason I'm going into all of this detail is because I don't think we're going to get to a place where we have technologies that are openly available for anyone in the world to use, or any qualified manufacturer to use, unless we start rethinking how we're financing the innovation in the first place. And if we remain in a system where we only have a few countries that say we are going to put a lot of money into our companies, usually, you know, primarily the US invested in US companies, not exclusively. Germany primarily invested in German companies. CEPI is a different story, but this is not a surprise to anyone who understands industrial policy. That's what you expect. Governments invest in their own companies because that's part of economic competitiveness, it's part of geopolitical advantage in this case, and that's not going to change until we find ways of cooperating internationally to fund R&D, to invest in R&D, and then require and demand that the knowledge that is produced is indeed made available. I do think we have really interesting models for making that know-how and that technology available. We know, for example, the Netherlands Vaccine Institute, it's a nonprofit vaccine institute, was crucial, I think 15 years ago, maybe even more than that, in transferring technology to enable the development and production of the meningitis vaccine. produced at very low cost. The International Vaccine Institute in South Korea, also publicly funded. Again, you know, these are sort of hubs of knowledge. WHO has recently set up a hub of, I don't know the details, I think others will know far more than me, but an mRNA technology hub. So the idea that you can have that know-how actually sitting in a centralized place that by design is made available to the world, meaning to qualified producers in this case, it's not a brand new idea. It's not an untested idea. It's actually a well-proven idea. So I'm not going to get into I'm certainly not an expert on how you could structure the knowledge ownership and the IP ownership, but I do think we have examples of establishing models that do not have to monopolize and close off knowledge, but can actually make it available as a common good. But I do think we can't rely on charity or a few governments saying, oh, we want to share this technology, because I think that's not the geopolitical context within which we live. So if we don't find ways internationally of constructing this cooperation among countries to do that, I think we're going to just be in the same boat that we're in today.
You need to construct the model in advance. It's not something that you cannot solve equitable access once it is there, if you have not designed the system such that it delivers the equitable access. And I think we come back to that again and again. And of course, financing will be really important. And I think in the discussions that we're having, the policy discussions that are happening now, in particular, specifically thinking about pandemic or epidemic preparedness and response, that's certainly a little bit the direction where some people are trying to push it. But yeah, would you only do it for an exception, or actually, and I come back to, aren't all health technologies, shouldn't they all be considered a little bit in the same way? And I want to come back with a final question to Victor before I'm going to read you a few of the questions we're getting through the Q&A. One specific thing, because you mentioned a few models, Suerie, around vaccines, and I mean, there are several examples of public vaccine production, Canada, the Netherlands, Cuba still today, but many other countries have actually gradually, you know, during the privatization wave of the 80s and 90s, privatized that. And while previously it was considered that vaccines, because of their really important public health role, I mean, not only providing individual protection, but actually also population-wide protection, they're a critically important public health intervention. And I think because of that, there used to be a stronger desire of countries to actually control and the manufacturing and the distribution or own it as a public asset. That has gradually been disappearing. And what we saw also is that actually the vaccine market was not a very attractive market within the pharmaceuticals. I think I read somewhere that the global vaccine market represents like 2 or 3% of the total market of pharmaceuticals. And we have seen, and Victor, you've done a lot of work on one specific example, how over the last 5 to 10 years, prices of medicines in particular have been going out of the roof. And that has created this highly, highly profitable market. And the difference between the medicines market and the vaccine market has just gotten bigger and bigger until COVID, obviously, because now we get suddenly this market prospect. I mean, the prices of vaccines that we are paying now, they're not low. They're actually quite high on a unit price compared to many of the, you know, the classic childhood vaccines and other vaccines. They are fractions of a dollar per dose that we're paying, and now we're talking 20, 40 globally. These are, and we've heard vaccine manufacturers saying, well, these are just pandemic prices. Afterwards, they will go up as well. So how do you see the fact that the vaccine market has suddenly become much more attractive? Will it quickly become as financialized? Will we see the same problems as we've seen in the medicines market happening on the vaccine side, despite their much more critical public health? Well, I'm not so much more critical, but kind of it's a different animal altogether, right? Vaccines as compared to treatments, because it's preventative, you vaccinate whole populations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that there's sort of two directions that I suspect that it could become financialized, and probably already is heading in that direction, unless, of course, a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of kind of the public and governments or multilateral institutions come up with a different arrangement. The reason I think that this could be attractive in that kind of model for the industry is, one, of course, you have the issue of this is a global market, but the second piece here is you're talking about potentially having recurring kind of boosters, right? So this is not going to be a one-time and done. If you have a situation where the science is pointing towards needing recurring immunizations, that you have now created a business model in which you actually want to hold on to that intellectual property, because you're seeing the Wall Street is expecting that they're forecasting this is going to be a 10-year growth market, right? And actually, this is what you're going to be able to, this is what firm insiders are able to trade off of, those forecasts, right? And so it was interesting last year when Francis Collins, the head of our revered institution, right, the National Institutes of Health, had remarked, we don't expect the pharmaceutical companies to make billions off of this. But interestingly enough, the firm insiders were already making hundreds of millions of dollars off of just trading on the stock of their companies, because the valuation was going up because Wall Street anticipates, right, that kind of long-term potential growth. And then I think the third piece here, right, so you've got big market size, you've got potential for recurring shots. And the third thing is, who decides when the emergency is over, right? And is it really ever over in the way that we're thinking about? If we're talking about population immunity, you've heard executives say, well, once this pandemic period is over, who decides that, right? That we'll start charging value-based pricing for vaccines, right? And what does that mean? That's not how we've priced polio, any other previous vaccines, right? But then the potential economic value of a vaccine is tremendous. Should that all be going to a small group of corporate shareholders? Obviously, I think we all share a particular answer on that, but I think those are the kinds of questions that policymakers need to be thinking about, because that's going to have huge public health implications over whether we're actually able to have a lasting kind of response, or whether certain places, or even years from now, are suffering from shortages or not able to cover their entire populations because of pricing and access issues. So I think vaccine market, particularly with COVID, could definitely be sort of head in that direction.
Yeah, and I when I'm looking at some of the questions that we're getting, there's a lot of interest in the idea of putting, conditionalities, the government as a regulator. But I mean, I think that the question is like, how far can you go, and why hasn't it happened more? And I mean, I'm myself unclear why. What was it really so like? Did governments really do not have leverage, or did they not want to use leverage or create leverage? I honestly, I don't quite understand why that is. But so what is your sense of what type of conditionalities would actually be totally or not totally acceptable, but could strike the right balance? Because I think there is also an understanding that, okay, companies function in the marketplace as they do. So how to create a right balance between the role they play in developing essential public health technologies. So it's not just the same like Ferraris or other luxury products. It's critical essential health technologies. What role can they play? How can the government create the right directionality and conditions such that indeed, we get value for money? I don't quite like that terminology, because value is really must be expressed in public health benefits. So what are opportunities that you see that could work? Any ideas?
I mean, I'm most familiar with this as a matter of, US law, and, certainly one could require upfront, and that, companies that get government grants or that are building on government technology, that they share information with their competitors for key research questions, that they make their data open and available to the public once a therapeutic or a vaccine is registered, that they price things fairly. I think what's a little frustrating, though, is that we also have all those tools at the back end. We could use them now. I mean, we have a government patent. We have that could be used to leverage, even though it wasn't done in the early grant agreements and so forth, could be used now. We also have very strong government rights in the United States to allow the government to override patents. And anytime it wishes, essentially, and just pay a royalty. We could use that route. We have many tools we could use, and we don't use them when you ask people in the government, well, why didn't you put conditions in these contracts? They say, well, everything was moving so fast and you don't want to slow things down. And and then you say, well, why are they gonna, why not use them now? And they don't, well, it'll upset the industry, there's always an answer about like why not to do this. And I'm not sure they're really I actually think, if we standardize some of these terms, the argument that's most often given against putting them into contracts in an emergency like this, that it will take time and it's complex, you wouldn't have to worry about that. You would have to address the concern that industry raises, which is if we don't make enough money, then there's no reason for us to be involved in this research. And you have to deal with that by ensuring that they make enough money to be commensurate with what they've done. I don't think that's rocket science. I mean, I think there are ways that many people have come up with, and there's sort of different models about how to measure what a fair price is, but there are ways to do that. My own view is that we should be asking something about the cost of R&D and not just the social value of the product. So as you mentioned, the sort of queasiness about how do we know what value is? Because, you could say a COVID vaccine is worth the entire global economy, and yet if it only costs $8 billion of public money to get all of these vaccines, should we empty the entire global economy into the pockets of some companies? No, that would be stupid. Right. So it's not obvious that the way we value anyway, which is so problematic and only based on what's measured in market terms, actually makes sense as a measure of what a fair return is. I think, it's really important to think about how much things cost to do and what a reasonable profit is. And so I think, those kinds of terms could be put into these deals up front. They could also be put into them at the back end. We just have to have governments in a position, particularly governments like the United States, which hold a lot of the power over these companies and have been utterly unwilling to kind of push them around to do something about it.
And I think it's not just the governments. Suerie, you mentioned CEPI. I know that they also, in their contract negotiations with companies, they have an access policy. They try to put some conditionalities into their contracts, but they are generally not so successful. And often, in certain moments, the companies just decide that they're not going to continue working with CEPI if they can get, certainly in the COVID vaccine situation. Moderna was initially financed by CEPI and the University of Oxford as well. And they decided that they would no longer continue working with CEPI because the strings that they were asked to attach were more than what they could get when they got just straight money from the US government or the UK government, who didn't want to put strings or didn't think it was needed. So it's a matter of negotiating power and also the perception of negotiating power. And when we hear how some of the contracts that have largely been kept confidential, just the fact that these demands are there to keep contracts confidential, to keep pricing confidential. When you talk to government representatives, they say, well, we don't have the leverage to go against that because the companies know they have something we want. We need it because we have our population's pressure. So we don't feel that we have strong enough leverage to do that. So I don't know, yeah, how can we empower governments to actually, be able to put much stronger, what do they have as leverage towards the companies if they wanted to?
I wanted to come in on this this specific point, because I think that I mean, looking at some of the specific examples that you are raising, my understanding is that Moderna had a very, very small grant, I think under $1 million from CEPI in the early days. And then boom, US government came in with $1 billion. CEPI doesn't have $1 billion in its back pocket. So I'm not sure to what extent was it access conditions, or was it, hey, we have a much bigger check coming in the door, and why wouldn't we go for a funder who, anyway, I think that there's this issue of competition in some ways among funders, and this also points back to the issue of geopolitical competition between countries. One thing I should have said earlier is that some of the numbers I gave on which countries invested in R&D, we don't have good data from Russia and China, so we actually don't know. Are they up there, next to some of the Western funders? It's not very clear. But I think the other interesting lesson, though, to take from the COVID-19 vaccine experience is that with smaller companies, there's a very different calculation, and there's a very different relationship with the funder. So if we look at, I think it's actually useful to spend a few minutes on the Russian, the Gamaleya vaccine, which was not developed by a company. It was developed actually by a research institute that does not have huge production capacity. It was developed, my understanding is, paid for largely by the Russian Development Investment Fund. And they have announced something like 50 technology transfer agreements. I think in part because they do not have large factories to supply all of the countries that might be interested in the Sputnik 5 vaccine. And this is a particular case. If we look at Novavax and Moderna, also small firms, they rely on money, whether that's from CEPI or US government or other sources. They don't have huge amounts of money coming in unless it's from some early venture capital investors, but they need that money to scale up manufacturing. And so I think the amount of leverage that funders have is going to be different when you're talking about some of the smaller firms. But I think that going back to the question of why don't at least some of the bigger funders ask for certain conditionalities, or why don't they insist on them? And I think some of it has to do with, this is not the way business was done. And there's actually a very, very limited set of previous experiences where affordability in particular was a clear condition of funding. And that comes out of the neglected disease experience, where you have a handful of product development partnerships and some firms who got public and philanthropic money to develop a product where it had to be affordable in some of the poorest countries. Otherwise, you've not met your goal. You've not been successful. There's not a lot of experience outside of this very small niche in the ecosystem for where, in the US, the government has not said, no matter what, that product has to be affordable. It's not been a goal of public policy. So it's got to be a goal, or this has got to be a bona fide goal and not just one that's sort of hidden in some statute in the corner that's never used. But I think that there's another reason, and that is perhaps a fear, an unfounded or an overinflated fear that if we touch the innovation process, it's such a mystery, it's such a black box. If we touch it, if we fiddle with it, if we reduce the earnings that could potentially come at the end, it'll just disappear, right? There won't be any innovation. And there is a real fear, I think, on the part of policymakers. And I think what we have to do is to demystify this innovation process. And in fact, I think academic researchers have made some really important progress in just the last 10 plus years in demystifying what are the costs and what are the risks. And I think earlier we were talking a lot about governments. We're still talking a lot about governments. Private firms do take on private costs. They do take on risk. And I think that's clear in the data. But how much risk and how much does it cost has been, I think, intentionally kept quite mysterious. But for vaccines, for example, it seems like out-of-pocket cost, phase 1, 2, 3 trials is going to be around $250, $300 million. That's not infinity, right? That's not billions. If we think about risks, the risks of success in a phase 3 trial, depending on the estimate, 40, 50, 70%, right? These are not infinitesimal. I mean, this is not massive risk. That means if you think about 70% out of 3 products, that's 2 that are successful. So what I'm trying to say is that if we continue to mythologize the risk that is taken on by the valiant capitalists, I think that we're going to be very hesitant indeed to fiddle with the system. But if we begin to look at the numbers and say, okay, well, how much does it really cost? And who takes on risk? And what's the risk really? And how do we compensate for that risk? I mean, picking up on what Amy was saying, how do we ensure that, in fact, the company is made whole? They earn a fair profit at the end of the day. They're not being asked to do what they're not set up to do, which is to operate at a loss. I think there's a lot more that could be done.
It resonates with one of the questions that say, what many people from startups say, well, we've put this money in, for instance, the mRNA research with the biotech for years. And now that it's successful, we want to have our share. And I think that per se, there is nothing wrong with that. The question is like, how much share for how much risk in the whole process? And as we said in the beginning, given that the way the system is now constructed, that it's kind of the winner takes it all. Like the one that comes up with a product at the end has then all the property rights or the marketing rights, etc. And no one else counts anymore. And then if it's a company, then it's the shareholders that win, but everybody else who along the way have contributed, in particular when it was government contribution, because that is not, there is no expectation when you give a government grant that there is money coming back. And I also would not, I mean, some people have been proposing, well, maybe the governments, when they finance research, they should also ask to get money back like an investor, which I think would just exacerbate the system. I don't think that that's where we want to go to, but we want to find a way to better calibrate where the risks are being taken, by whom, who is financing, and that at the end of the day, that it's not the winner takes it all. And I mean, currently the shareholders of these small companies, I mean, they are making so much money. And if you see how much of public and private research over many years and experiences, I mean, we talk a lot about the mRNA vaccines, but even the adenoviral vectors, I mean, they've been developed with a lot of public funding for different pathologies. The University of Oxford got money to develop them for MERS, I think. They have a malaria vaccine. There are Zika vaccines, Ebola. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine is the same platform as they used for Ebola. So there is a lot of kind of and I think it's good, because science and technology needs to build on what we have, but somehow we have created this way in which then through ownership, the extraction of the rewards only happens at the end by a few, and we don't have actually the sharing of the rewards. And it doesn't need to be, I think, financially, but more in terms of how can we share the medical benefits of these inventions. Going back to a few questions, there was a specific question about the question of whether governments should be buying out intellectual property rights or companies instead of, at a certain point, instead of rewarding the companies by paying high prices for many, many years, whether at some point it wouldn't be better to just buy it out and then, I guess, put it in the public domain or use it yourself. Any thoughts on that?
People have talked about this as a solution in particular cases where, for example, you have the hepatitis C treatments come out and somebody looks at the figures and says, we could buy this company for less than we're paying.
Exactly.
And treat a lot more people. And so I think it's a very interesting idea. You know, it's been proposed for either governments or pension funds. There are, you know, there's some entities that are large enough that they could maybe mobilize the amount of capital that would be needed. And I'm sure there'd be issues about what would happen if you tried to, you know, do a hostile takeover of these companies or tried to buy them. But it's certainly an interesting idea. You know, at a broader scale, I'm not sure what it would mean to like buy all of the companies and then put them in the public domain. It would effectively mean you wouldn't have private companies anymore. Then, you know, and then the question would just be, well, how do you feel about fully like all the government doing all of the research from, you know, every stage of the ecosystem? I think another way to think about it could be, is there some public-private model, but where the public would get more of the benefits directly? Because it had more of an ownership stake. You know, when we've been talking here in the United States about mRNA vaccine production and what's the model to get to scale that the world needs, there's essentially no mRNA. You know, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are almost entirely being consumed by the United States and to some degree Europe, about to be more. You know, we've been talking about, well, is there a model that's kind of like what we have national labs that were used to develop essentially nuclear technology and other kinds of nefarious things. And they are publicly owned, but contract operated. And those labs are organized that way, I think, in part for national security reasons, that the government actually wants to own everything. But it has also, I think, shaped some of how they operate and their ability both to take big risks and long-term, make long-term investments in basic science. But then they've used the private sector as a contractor. You know, you guys run the lab and we'll, you know, and so I think it's possible to think about models like that in pharma and say, well, why couldn't the government, just the way it did with GM or something, essentially own the company, but allow the existing infrastructure architecture to operate? I don't have a good answer right now as to like what would the benefits of that be over the benefits of real systematic price control as well. You know, like all these other policy, you know, kind of basket that we're talking about that would say require sharing so that we don't have research bottlenecks and require patent, you know, conditions when the government is invested and require price controls. It's not obvious to me that there would be huge benefits at a system scale to sort of switching the model to like the government's an owner now, and sort of like using that lever in its ownership capacity. But it's interesting to think about.
Also a critical aspect to the fact that as long as we keep on seeing medical technologies as commodities of which you can build a very profitable business, that we're always going to get stuck into like the lack of convergence between the public health goal and the business goal, and that it's very difficult to imagine a kind of win-win for everybody, that you have the most amazing new technologies that are available and affordable for everybody at any time where needed, and so necessarily relatively cheap, and making the most profitable business model that we have learned in health for all the reasons that Suerie you laid out in the beginning, including that there is there is a third-party payer, we don't really have a normal market, etc. It's extremely profitable. As we know, the pharmaceutical sector, the biomedical healthcare sector, is one of the more profitable industrial sectors, but that is because people will sell their home if needed, if they are about to die, but that is not the kind of value extraction that we want for health, right? We have a different value proposition for health technology. So should we start there and kind of agree that health and health interventions should not be considered ordinary commodities, and then start from there?
Elsa, if I can just jump in here, I think part of the challenge is, when we think about, I'm going to be, as a sociologist, thinking about the question of power, right? And power here can operate in a very kind of obvious, coercive way, direct contributions to, politicians, or lobbying around a particular piece of legislation or around a contract. I think the challenge here is it operates in more subtle ways, I think, in terms of a lot of these policy spaces. And so I sort of draw on that concept of hegemony, which is that I think oftentimes where we get stuck is that there's we've been made to think that there's a certain common sense view, and that it's like sort of like the naturalized way that things have to operate. And I think that's part of what we're running up against in terms of reframing the terms of the debate itself. And I think that's, that is a particular challenge that I think as scholars and academics and people who are trying to create reform have to sort of always keep in mind. And I think a lot of the demythologizing work is actually really critical to that enterprise. I think the other piece that I do want to point out actually is, I actually sort of make a distinction between the idea of a commodity and an asset, right? And I actually think that actually affects the way some of these conversations happen if we have a different concept in a political economy sense. Commodities gain their value through exchange, but the interesting thing is assets gain their value through ownership, right? And that ownership value comes from how much do you think you can make money in the future on something, right? It's the future-oriented value that you actually really care about, which is why these debates are so politically contentious, because there's a lot of future value at stake. And that actually has implications for how we even try and answer these questions, because it becomes almost untethered from kind of any real tangible things that we can look at and point at and say, okay, this process costs this much money, and so we should consider that. Instead, we get a system in which, well, the asset is valued at whatever the market is valuing it at based on what they think they can get for it. And so, a company, let's say like Gilead, they buy a company like Pharmasset in the Hep C process for $11 billion. Now that $11 billion isn't at all connected to what Pharmasset spent on R&D, right? They spent total as a company $270 million on their entire R&D over 10 years. So then it creates, I think, challenging questions about like, how do we even think about compensation around R&D costs when the companies turn around and say, well, we risked $11 billion, right, into the process, but that's sort of like a fiction of, or an artifact of the financial market, in that's what the market valued it at. So I think that's sort of an interesting kind of wrinkle, in that we're dealing with assets here that are very much protected in stock markets. And that's where I think the conversations around industrial organization really matter, because then you have to start thinking about who are the actors in the system that, when we're thinking about public-private partnerships, we can sort of rethink and definancialize, right? Take out of the kind of stock market system and maybe think about different kinds of angles into relationships and governance regulation that sort of allow us to more tether questions of price and value to like actual public health benefit. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does totally. But we're also running a little bit out of time. So I'm going to ask each of you to kind of give a very short answer to the $10 billion question that someone in the audience has given to us. So much of the needed change comes from changing the system from inside, changing capitalism, definancialization, and political economy. And the question is, how to do that? So I think I want to maybe first start by thanking you all, the three panelists, for already having contributed to that reflection throughout the past 1.5 hours. But maybe you have like one kind of key thing to add to that before we close, knowing that this is a start of a conversation that we can continue for many hours, and I think we will continue for many years trying to contribute at least to reforming capitalism to better address health needs. And maybe one final thing here before I give the last word to the panelists. As many of you know, Mariana Mazzucato will be chairing a newly established council, WHO Council on the Economics for Health for All. And I think part of that is actually rethinking and reframing how we see the role of the economy, not with health as an input in the economy, but where the health and well-being of people should be an output of the economy. So how can we reframe, rethink the way we do economic policy and health policy such that they synergize, but that we measure success not in GDP, where there is nothing at all that relates to health, but actually in ways that puts health and well-being of people at the center. So I think that will be part of those conversations that we will be having. But now going maybe starting with Suerie, what would you kind of throw in here as a how to change capitalism to be better for health?
I think we have to change governments. I think we have to change the mentality, the rules of the game, and particularly the way governments work with each other or don't work with each other. And I think if we leave the political interests out of the picture, we're going to miss a big part of it. And so I do think we have a very unique opportunity now with debates beginning on how do we reform the global system in the aftermath of this catastrophe. One important strand has to be on how can governments cooperate more to fund R&D, to accompany innovation so that at the end of the day, the outputs, that health technology innovation is made available to everyone, and that most countries in the world are not, in fact, left out in the cold as we're seeing today. I think this is a huge agenda for the years to come.
Thank you. Amy?
I mean, one way to think about the definition of capitalism, this is Ellen Wood's definition, is that everybody is subject to the profit imperative, that capital as well as labor, right? And that creates problems of the kind that Victor was just talking about. You try to take something sort of out of the profit kind of motive, and the market adjusts. And so I think that to me, if we want some goods and some things that are essential, I think here when I teach Karl Polanyi's work on the idea that there are these fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money, and we have to take them out of the market or we cease to be human in some sense. Because if we make human beings the subject of market forces, so either they compete and win or they hunger and die, then we're no longer a human society, right? So I think it sort of thinking about kind of the nature of capitalism and what it would mean to change it, I think requires us to identify things that we think are essential to human life and to our social values together and our politics. And I think obviously medicines and health are one of those. I think, very critically, in part because we are not imagining, I think, well, let's say, I think the questions that Victor is putting on the table, and that also the question did about financialization, about corporate structure. I also think investment authorities and thinking about national monetary policy, all of these things have to be in the mix if we are going to successfully set public priorities and determine and make sort of industrial activity, invention, and ultimately also markets work to meet human priorities as opposed to making humans subject to market priorities. So in each area that might look a little bit, I think we need this overall architecture, right? If you have a national investment authority and you have a monetary policy that's built on the idea that the government actually is the creator of money, then you can invest in very deliberate ways, which would not be true if you have an imaginary that says, well, the way we get money is we tax people. Then you're much more constrained by capital flight and other things. So we need an overall picture that can kind of integrate these ideas. But in health, we also have the benefit that unlike with other industries, there's enormous public sector here already. And so even before we get to redesigning the global financial architecture, monetary systems, and so forth, and creating these sovereign, investment funds and things, we can publicize more of that architecture and infrastructure. And in fact, we're quite far there. I mean, there's a deep kind of socialism embedded in our healthcare system, both because of the way insurance works and because of the role of government investment in research. I think there's a real missed opportunity if we don't expand that to a very substantial degree to start solving some of these problems in the short run, while we're also thinking about the broader political economy and how to change it.
I think that's a pretty excellent synthesis. I think that ultimately, we are in that kind of a moment where there is, I think, a real opportunity to have the kind of structural transformations that I think we're sort of discussing. And Polanyi had this concept, to draw off of what Amy just mentioned, of the double movement, right, in society. That sort of, there's one move towards kind of having this fictitious kind of self-regulating market where really human life isn't protected ultimately and secured, and then there's a movement against that, right, and that imagines new possibilities. That might not be the exact interpretation of what Polanyi meant, but I think we're in sort of a movement where I think there's a lot more possibilities potentially opening up. And in the specific area of biomedical research and innovation, I think how we construct and think about sort of the public at least in the US health policy space, sometimes we talk about the public option in terms of insurance, but sort of what are the public options? And it's a plural of directions we could go. And I think it's probably going to look less like one solution, but sort of a toolkit and a menu, because there's going to be different kinds of strategies we're going to want to use for different kind of therapeutic and public health problems. So I think that's the hope, that this kind of moment teaches us and can kind of urge us to imagine.
Well, thank you so much. So then I can only thank all of you, Victor, Amy, Suerie, for this great talk and our conversation that we can have, and IIPP, and in particular Victoria, Henry, Rosie, and Mariana for having created this opportunity. I think that there is much more to be said and much more to be built upon, but I think that we are all continuing to work and engage and do research and advocacy in this space, and I think that we need to keep give our voices a lot of volume, such that we actually can hopefully also influence in the right direction.